Growing up, I played a lot of the Pokemon games, and now I have gotten really into the Metroidvania genre, so I was like, what if Pokemon was a Metroidvania? And it was made by someone who sucks at art. So, if you don't know what the Metroidvania genre is, basically, it is a big game with lots of exploration and backtracking. Also, I made this game several years ago when I first started getting into game development. And no joke, this was my very second project. And in hindsight, not such a great idea to start off game dev with such a large project. Initially, my original plan for this project was to make about 8 different areas you can explore, and the game would only consist of the original 151 Pokemon, cause otherwise there's way too many Pokemons nowadays. Anyways, when making this game, I took a lot of inspiration from a Metroidvania game called Lilies, where Lily, the character you control, does not directly fight the enemies herself. Rather, Lily will summon various allies to fight for her, where each ally will have their own unique attacks and abilities, which is essentially what happens in Pokemon. So after designing my player character and the starter Pokemons, to the best of my non-existent drawing abilities, I followed several tutorials to try and recreate the movements in Lilies, where aside from your basic movement, the player can also dodge through enemies as well as ledge grab. And it was totally easy getting these movements to work as intended, and it definitely didn't take an entire week of constant screaming and suffering. Anyways, for each of the starter Pokemon, I incorporated their actual in-game moves, but also would use Vine Whip as a melee attack. Squirtle will use Water Gun to shoot a projectile as a ranged ability, and Charmander on the other hand will charge up a powerful flamethrower that deals massive damage in an area. However, it cannot be used as frequently as the rest. In Lilies, every time you summon an ally, you'll be frozen in place. However, I decided that in this game, every time you summon a Pokemon ally, the player won't freeze. Instead, I made it so they will have the same velocity as the player, because it was a little weird for the Pokemon to just appear and fall, or just be stuck to the player. As a result, the gameplay mostly involves on Pokemon. After getting the basic mechanics to work, I began working on my first area, which I decided to set in a forest, for some reason. And as I mentioned before, I'm terrible at drawing, especially backgrounds. Anyways, since this is just the starting area, the beginning enemies are not really all that menacing, and have a pretty simple behavior. For example, Caterpie only moves back and forth like a red Koopa from Mario, and Metapod, Caterpie's evolved form, will simply fall if they are above the player. All the enemies that I program all use Raycast, which is an invisible laser that helps detect any collision within sight. This allows Caterpie to detect if there's a ground in front of it, and also prevents Metapod from falling if there's a platform in between itself and the player. Next, I made Bellsprout and Pidgey, which will simply chase the player when in line of sight. There are also enemies in the later part of this area which can perform actual attacks, canonical to their games. For example, Oddish will use Poison Powder if the player gets too close, which scatters a cloud of poisonous dust in an area that continuously damages the player. After designing a few enemies, I implemented a loot feature, such that every time you defeated a hostile Pokemon, they will drop these EXP candies, which can be used to level up your Pokemon and make them stronger. And if you level them up enough, they will evolve into even stronger forms, just like in the original game. Each time our Pokemon evolve, aside from dealing more damage, they will also gain some sort of enhancement, such as greater range, extra projectiles, or shorter cooldowns. Another feature in Lilies is that the only enemies that you are allowed to recruit as an ally are bosses or mini-bosses. The mini-bosses are slightly stronger versions of existing Pokemon, with different AI behaviors and attacks. So in the first areas, the only Pokemons that I made catchable are Pidgey and Oddish. For Pidgey, I made it so that it will summon a gust of wind to attack everything around itself, and since it is a flying Pokemon, it is not affected by gravity like the rest of the Pokemon when summoned. Whereas Oddish will use Sludge Bomb to hurl a projectile in a curved trajectory. The first main boss of the area is Butterfree, which is the final evolved form of Caterpie. Butterfree will constantly chase a player, and every several seconds, it will either perform a tackle attack, in which Butterfree will charge at the player, or use Poison Powder. For all the bosses that I made in this game, each boss will have 2 phases. The second phase is triggered once they reach half health, in which they will enter a frenzy state, becoming faster, attack more frequently, as well as unleash new attacks. In Butterfree's case, it will now tackle twice in a row, and the Poison Powder covers a larger area. Furthermore, it will also use Harden, which will temporarily reduce damage taken from the player's attacks, which acts as an introduction to buffing moves, which will appear more common in the next area. Once Butterfree's health is depleted, the player can capture and later summon Butterfree to use its poison powder against other enemies. And since it is the main boss, the player will also acquire a double jump, which will help the player reach new and previously inaccessible parts of the map. The second area of this game is the swampy section, which features new enemies as well as water. So right now, if you jump into the water, you'll just simply float on top. But later in the game, once you find and defeat a boss with an upgrade that allows you to dive, you'll be able to explore the underwater area. Anyways, I got too lazy to draw another background for this place. Not that I suck on anything. Instead, I just tinted the previous background. Yeah, totally different. As previously mentioned, some of the common enemies in this area can now use buffing abilities, which can either increase their attack, defense, or even their speed. By the time I started working on this new area, I got a bit better at coding, where the enemies have more complex behaviors, such as calculating and launching projectiles at the player, and some enemies are better at chasing the player, to a certain degree. Anyways, midway through the swamp area, I created my most sophisticated enemy yet, Retro-Bell, which is the final evolved form of Bellsprout and Weeping Bell. Essentially, I hooked Retro-Bell with a timer such that it will use a random number of Razor Leaf attacks, then a random number of lunges, before using its most powerful move, Leaf Storm, which continuously damages the player and can potentially insta-kill the player! Yay! Throughout this new area, there have been more complex enemies, so it's only fair that the new Pokemons that you can add to your party are also given the same treatment, in which they will also use Raycast to spawn an attack on the nearest enemy within sight, or assist with aiming. Once you reach the end of the swamp, I decided to make Snorlax as the main boss of this area. In a lot of Pokemon games, Snorlax is always found sleeping and blocking your path. Normally you have to find an item that will wake him up, but I made it so that you can straight up roast him alive into his wake. Snorlax has a pretty straightforward attack pattern, where he will perform several body slams in a row, in which he'll jump so unnaturally high and come slamming down. I also gave Snorlax Snarl, which is an attack that doesn't do any physical damage, but rather inflicts the player with sleep status, which causes the player to fall asleep for a few seconds. Well, standing up, somehow. Which will leave you vulnerable to Snorlax's next onslaught of attacks. Similar to Butterfree, when Snorlax reaches half health, his attacks will become faster, and he'll use Snarl twice in a row, making it more difficult to evade. Furthermore, Snorlax will begin to unleash its strongest move, called Giga Impact, where Snorlax will charge at the player with every bit of its power, dealing massive damage. But then he gets tired like a baby. Upon defeating Snorlax, not only can you use him in battle, but you'll also be able to unlock the usage of ultimate attacks. Because going forth, the final evolution of each Pokemon are far more terrifying and can use very powerful attacks. Basically, the player will get a special meter that charges up every time you attack an enemy. Once it is fully charged up, whilst holding a certain button and summoning a Pokemon, that Pokemon will unleash its ultimate attack. Honestly, these are moves that they don't learn until their final evolution or when they reach higher levels. But I don't care, it's less complicated this way. The next area that I worked on was this haunted mansion, which harbored various ghosts and mysterious Pokemon. And the ghost type Pokemon are able to go through walls. Anyways, in the original 151 Pokemon, there were only 3 ghost type Pokemons, so in order to make the levels feel not too repetitive, I made it so that each ghost Pokemon could have multiple behaviors. For example, with Ghastly, it will either constantly chase the player, or teleport around the player and perform a lick attack, or simply stay stationary and launch a bunch of Will-O-Wisp at the player. Next, I made Haunter, which is Ghastly's evolved form. For Haunter, I made 2 variations, one which is a fast chaser, and will also perform a flying Shadow Punch. The other variation will slowly chase the player, but will perform the move Hex, which spawns a delayed attack on the player. Furthermore, I also added Clefairy to this area, which is a Pokemon known for its attack, Metronome, which uses a random Pokemon attack in existence. In other words, it can perform any of the attacks that I've already made. So it could possibly use a very powerful move that could instantly kill the player, or just do literally nothing. And also, you can catch this Pokemon too, and potentially use an insane attack, or just splashes around. Anyways, after reaching the halfway point, I decided to jump scare the player with a mid-boss fight, Gengar, which is the final evolved form of Ghastly and Haunter. Similar to Ghastly, Gengar will teleport around the player and either use Lick, Shadow Ball, a projectile attack, or summon a bunch of ominous shadows appearing from the ground where the player is located. And when Gengar reaches Phase 2, Gengar's attacks are faster and more devastating. Plus, Gengar will also use another attack, which I completely made up, where it'll send its shadow to relentlessly chase the player as a constant stage hazard. So after designing Gengar's boss fight and making an ally version, which can also go through walls by the way, next up was making the final part of the Haunted Mansion, where the final boss will be Alakazam, and you'll be able to unlock the teleport ability, which is an upgraded dash that allows you to pass through obstacles with small gaps. But I ran out of motivation and stopped working on the project. So yeah, I spent about a year on this project, and I was a little too ambitious for my second game, and it ended up taking way longer than I expected. I also had more upgrades that the player could unlock, such as the ability to dive underwater, rock climb, and destroy these indestructible tiny trees. Because as you know, in the Pokemon universe, it's impossible to go around or destroy a tiny tree. Unless you have a Pokemon that knows cut. I also even came up with a storyline for this project of mine, where one day, all of a sudden, a mysterious purple light enveloped the sky, causing all the Pokemon to go on a rampage and attack all humans. However, you, the protagonist Pokemon, were unaffected due to the coincidental presence of Mew, a legendary psychic Pokemon who has the ability to dispel the effects of this mysterious light. So you, your Pokemon, and alongside Mew, set off on a journey to unveil the origin of the purple light. And that's all, folks. And unfortunately, for very obvious reasons, this game will be released because I don't want to anger the Nintendo gods. Anyways, in bidding adieu to this temporal junction of our intertwined existences, I hereby relinquish our current interaction, acknowledging